Capital is abundant. Understanding is scarce. The Dynamo Show goes deep with the new industrialists rejuvenating industry and commerce. Brought to you by Dynamo Ventures. Learn more at dynamo.vc/podcast. Now, here's your host, Madeline O'Farrell.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Dynamo Show. We're excited to have you. And today we have Friddy from Scope Recruiting. And Friddy, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of recruiting in supply chain, tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners.
Yeah, happy to. So I started my career in supply chain actually with ABB in a rotational program, and then ended up with Thomas & Betts as category manager before we moved back to North Carolina. Figured there weren't that many supply chain jobs in the Asheville area, so we started a supply chain recruiting firm called Scope Recruiting with the idea that we were hiring supply chain professionals and teaching them the recruiting side of the business instead of trying to teach recruiters about supply chain. So we've been doing that for almost 10 years now, and we really feel like it brings a lot of value to our clients, that given that we have that supply chain background, because one, we really understand their needs, why they're looking to hire, what they're looking to accomplish by hiring for those supply chain positions. And on the flip side, when we talk to candidates, one, they really appreciate when they can talk to somebody who isn't just reading off a script, but they can actually have a conversation with. And it allows us to really dig deeper into that second, third level of questions and make sure candidates don't just look great on paper, which has gotten easier than ever now, but actually can walk the talk.
I'm curious, in your prior supply chain roles that ultimately led you to start Scope, what was the friction or what were the problems you were encountering around recruiting that led you to start your own recruiting firm?
Yeah, it wasn't really that we felt like we were in these supply chain roles and we saw that need. It was really more so us relocating to an area where there wasn't a lot of manufacturing in the US. So we were kind of presented with the question of, okay, I was commuting at that point an hour and a half every day. And my wife actually was the one who got into supply chain recruiting first, really more so out of necessity and kind of a little bit of luck getting into that there weren't that many supply chain roles where we moved to. And there was a niche boutique recruiting firm in the area that was specializing in supply chain. However, come to find out after my wife worked there for about 2 years, nobody there actually had a supply chain background. So she quickly realized that having that supply chain background really was hugely beneficial, and that if you specialize in supply chain, knowing what supply chain looks like hands-on is a huge plus.
Why do you think that is? What's the nuance about supply chain that makes that background so important when you're hiring for these roles?
I think it would be great in all roles, right? Wherever we go, if you talk to engineers, I have engineering friends that tell me, hey, I get approached by recruiters all the time and they don't really understand what I do. Same in software development, right? My brother-in-law is a software developer. He gets approached by recruiters all the time and he tells me, hey, they call me for roles that's not really a fit because they don't understand what I'm doing. And that's the same in supply chain. It's a supply chain manager, right? Let's go with a supply chain manager. A supply chain manager could be 10 different things in 10 different companies in 10 different industries. So a supply chain manager, right, does a lot of different things. Sometimes they even have customer service, right? It could be procurement, logistics, warehouse, demand planning, and in some instances, customer service as well. And then, right, depending on where companies are in their supply chain journey, it could be a very tactical role or it could be a very strategic role. So understanding where companies are with their supply chain, understanding what industries they're in, and then understanding, right, what they're looking for within that specific role is a huge advantage of. And then, right, being able to look at a candidate's resume and understand, okay, do they actually fit those requirements that the company has, or do they something different with a very similar title?
That makes a lot of sense. And could you peel back the curtain for us? When an organization approaches you and wants to fill a senior position within their procurement team or other supply chain function, what's actually happening behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think great question. And that's something we always encourage companies to do as well, because the number one thing we see is that there is a lack of clarity before hiring for a role. So what we always do is when we start a position, we go and talk to the stakeholders at the company and we map out an ideal candidate profile. And then afterwards, we send that over for approval. And we are saying, okay, this is what we talked about you're looking for. These are the soft skills, these are the hard skills, this is the experience, this is the industry background, and all of that. And then we say, right, if we could fabricate that perfect candidate, what would it look like? And I think that's really step number one, and it's really important because a lot of times our clients come to us and they say, to stick with that supply chain manager, we're looking for a supply chain manager. They come with a generic job description, and they haven't really mapped out what success looks like for that role in the first 6 months, in the first 12 months. And that leads them to really slow down the hiring process. And a lot of times it leads to, in large part, why they can't find the right candidates. Because one, the job description is too generic. Two, when they're going through the process and we don't have that internal alignment first, different people in the process might hire for different things. So we always want to make sure we have clear alignment up front. We have a specific job description. And then we create a candidate scorecard on which we compare each candidate that we submit to that ideal candidate profile to create as much objectivity in the hiring process as we can. Hiring is always subjective, right? And even for us, interviewing for a role today and a week later, it's gonna change a little bit on how we approach that role. So having that scorecard to fall back on, I think, really helps with creating objectivity in that hiring process, and then also a sense of urgency once you have somebody that gets really close to that ideal candidate profile. Let's say we have a 9 out of 10 candidates that we find, having that sense of urgency to say, okay, we actually found the perfect candidate here. Let's not get him. Let's make sure we land that candidate and act quickly, I think is very important as well.
You alluded to a scorecard as central to how you assess candidates. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What are some of the key components of that scorecard for maybe the common roles that you're hiring for?
Yeah, and I think for folks in supply chain, and it should be fairly familiar to them, it's not different than a vendor scorecard. It's really a matrix, a rubrics where we have set up front, okay, what are the most important experiences? It could be a certain category experience. It could be experience with a certain ERP system. It could be experience with strategic sourcing in general. And then, right, so we list the top 5 skills that are most important to be successful in the role. And then we have the most important 3 or 4 culture fit and soft skills on there as well. That could be, right, a lot of times we work with middle market companies. So it's that self-starter, entrepreneurial mindset a lot of times, the adaptability, the being agile, being able to wear multiple hats, the things that are very important in mid-sized organizations where responsibilities aren't as clearly defined yet as maybe in some of those Fortune 500 companies. So then when we interview candidates, typically about, right, 45 minutes to an hour, we try to get as much detail on their experience, and we always try to encourage our candidates, right, when they go into the interviews, give us real life examples with real life outcomes and the impact and the role you played in those projects. I think when interviewing, having general statements and statements like we did this, or we achieved 10 million in savings, right? That's always a lot of times too generic. It's really a good interview answer is always very specific, very outcome oriented, saying this is what we did, this is what my role was in the process, and this was the business outcome we achieved. And we try to dig in as much as possible to get as many examples as possible, and then score them on our candidate scorecard against that ideal candidate profile and say, okay, this is some experience and some projects they've done in terms of strategic sourcing, and this is the tools they use, this is the methodology they use, and these are the outcomes they achieved. And then we summarize that and score that on our on our candidate scorecard.
That's really interesting. Cost reduction and supplier risk management are often in direct tension with one another. Cheaper suppliers means more risk. How do you think the best supply chain leaders balance both of those at the same time? And how do you screen for that as you recruit?
Yeah, I think over the last 6 years, the pendulum has definitely swung towards risk mitigation, right? With the amount of disruptions we had from COVID to inflation, to tariffs, to shipping, container shortages, and all the above, the organizations have learned the hard way that being single source out of a country in Asia is very high risk, and probably worked really well in the 2000s and 2010s. But since COVID, that's kind of been thrown out the window, and really it's come down to having multiple approved vendors while trying to keep costs as low as possible. But really it's more about the relationship building, I feel like, with vendors now, because the companies that they were able to thrive and survive during COVID and during inflation and during all of that are the companies that had good relationships with their vendors, and that had a priority with their vendors, right? They weren't squeezed to the last cent, so the vendors were still putting you as a priority to get your products first, because you had that relationship, and then the vendors were wanting to make sure that they keep that relationship. So I think it's really shifted quite a bit to value out engineering projects, right? Where you work with your vendors and say, okay, how can we improve our product that it fits your production capabilities better, while ideally improving our cost, instead of just going in there with an e-auction and say, hey, we have 10 vendors bidding on the thing. Let's try to get the lowest price possible. It's still possible in commodity products, but I think overall there's been a big shift towards vendor relationships and risk mitigation, and making sure you have multiple approved vendors in different regions. And so when something happens, you're able to pivot.
Makes sense. And I think that aligns with what we hear elsewhere in supply chain, that it's really about diversification of where you're sourcing, and not being too concentrated in any particular area, especially if that area might have geopolitical tension layers on top of it. Um, you've made a high volume of placements across Fortune 500s and high growth startups. I'm curious, over the years, what the winning profile has looked like, whether it's certain skills or operating styles, and how has that changed, if at all?
I think it's probably still changing. I think when we started 10 years ago, that niche knowledge a lot of times was very important, especially right with larger companies where you don't necessarily need a generalist, but you need, in large companies, right? Everything is so clearly defined that they're looking for those niche experts, and they're still valuable, and especially in those very large organizations, I think having that niche knowledge about very specific categories, maybe with even right an engineering background and engineering understanding of the materials and the categories you source for, that's still important. But AI has certainly made it a lot easier to acquire that knowledge. So having the people skills, the ability to work with cross-functionally, to work with vendors, to make connections, to present a business case, to communicate, but also to adapt to new situations, certainly has gotten more and more valuable. And that niche knowledge that used to be the very sought after, I think, is kind of getting replaced, because you can learn so much so quickly about steel. If you wanted to know things about steel, their characteristics, what they do, it's gotten easier than ever to get those answers very quickly.
That makes sense. And on the point of cross functionality, when a procurement team is truly embedded into ops and engineering, not just consulted, what do you think that unlocks in terms of cost efficiency and supply resilience that maybe a siloed procurement team can't deliver?
Yeah, fantastic questions, and certainly something a lot of our clients are going through that process of realizing, okay, we need to treat procurement as a strategic business function and have them involved from the very first step in the process, right? Let's say you're a manufacturer, you're designing new products. It used to be that in the end, right, engineering, ops, they designed a product, they came to procurement and said, hey, go buy me these parts. Um, these parts might not have been something their current vendors could even manufacture. So a lot of times procurement had to go and find new vendors, delaying the process, pricing was uncertain. Having procurement on the table from day one allows you to design your products with your vendors' production capabilities in mind, because you not only need to know your own production capabilities, but you also need to know what your vendors are good at and what you can get cost effective from your vendors. And if you know what your vendors can do, if you make certain tweaks in your products, it could increase or lower your prices. So having procurement there really as a extension of your vendors is, I think, hugely beneficial to businesses. And so treating supply chain and treating procurement as a core business function, I think, has huge implications across the value chain, not only from, right, making sure your products are designed with your vendors' capabilities in mind, but then also understanding, okay, right, which products are we getting locally? Which products do we have to go overseas for, which then impacts lead time? So having all that information up front, I think, just strengthens your whole business and manufacturing process.
Certainly agree with that. As we talked about earlier, you have worked with a number of high growth startups. And I'm curious, when do you think a founder, at what stage of the business, do you think a founder should be thinking about hiring for real category management depth?
Yeah, I think a lot of times the decision comes, right, when do we start creating a supply chain team? At what point do we take the procurement out of the hand of operations, where a lot of times, right, it's engineering, it's ops who does the procurement? At what point do you switch and say, okay, we do have the volume now to justify creating a procurement team who focuses on that? And I think depending on the business, it makes sense at different stages, and depending on how you start that business. But I think it probably happens too late in a lot of instances. It happens that um, owners, founders, or the engineering team believe they can handle the procurement side, and they can certainly handle the tactical procurement side. But I think a lot of high growth startups could grow quicker and more cost effective if they would hire that supply chain professional sooner, knowing that, right, with the expectations that if they hire somebody for a certain salary, that a procurement professional can probably pay for their own salary within 3 or 4 months. And so for high growth startups, I think a lot of times they wait a little bit too long, thinking that they have it under control, which from a tactical side they might, right? But they could have been growing faster or more profitable if they had hired that procurement professional sooner.
For these scaling industrial startups, what advice would you give as they try to compete for the best in class talent from the Fortune 500 companies? What's a pitch that actually works?
It is, and Fortune 500 candidates don't always work in the startup environment. And I think that's something I've been kind of alluding to a little bit, is that the different mindset you need in the two different organizations, right? In those very large organizations, everything is very clearly defined. There's systems in place. You have an analyst. There's, right, an engineering team. So you work within a very specific niche in those large organizations, and you need to be an expert in that niche. In smaller organizations and startups, it's a lot of times wearing that multiple hats, taking care of whatever comes across your desk, being able to prioritize, not necessarily waiting for somebody to tell you what to do, or giving you a clearly defined goal or task or project, but saying, okay, just use your time as efficiently as possible. So the translation from large organization to small organization is something we always caution companies. I think a lot of times the best mix is somebody who's been mentored and trained in the large organizations, but got fed up with the bureaucracy, with the pace of those companies, and said, I want to be in those small organizations. So ideally, a lot of times the ideal candidate for our clients in that scenario is somebody who's done both. They've had the training, they've seen best practices, they've seen what a world-class supply chain looks like, but then they've already transitioned and proven themselves that they can work in those smaller environments. But really the pitch that works is that a lot of candidates, I think, in those larger organizations are fed up with the bureaucracy, with the politics, with the pace at which those companies are moving, and saying, hey, you can build a supply chain team here, you can have an immediate impact where you can make decisions immediately, and just that sense of ownership that I think is lacking a lot of times in those larger organizations can be very appealing to the right candidates.
Absolutely makes sense. If you were starting a procurement team from zero today, would you opt for 1 Rockstar generalist or 3 specialists?
To start with, the 1 Rockstar generalist for sure. That's what you need in those early situations. And then you become more and more specialized as you grow. But that generalist who can take care of whatever comes across his or her desk is definitely the way to start.
Understood. I know you have a border collie, so tell me, who do you think is harder to train, a top-tier category manager or Milo the border collie?
A category manager for sure. He might be smarter than myself in some instances, and definitely I have 3 kids under 3 now, and he still beats all 3 of them.
Fair enough. Well, Friddy, that is all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time on The Dynamo Show.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review and tell us what you liked. And be sure to head over to podcast.dynamo.vc to keep up to date with our latest content, or subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Until next time.